like to turn to Hebrews chapter 7. We'll read verses 22 through verse 28. Hebrews 7, verses 22 through 28. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament, and they truly were many priests, because they were not suffered or permitted to continue by reason of death. But this man, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost, that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth, to make intercession for them. For such a high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens, who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for their own sins, and then for the people's. For this he did once, when he offered up himself. For the law maketh men high priests, which have infirmity. But the word of the oath, which was since the law, maketh the Son who is consecrated for evermore. These verses speak of the priesthood of Christ being superior to the Old Testament priesthood of Aaron. I want to take the thought of the message. There's much here, but I want to take the thought of the message from verse 25. Notice able, and then to the uttermost. And that's what we want to speak upon, able to the uttermost. It's in the context, again, of Christ's priesthood. Christ being our priest. Christ is presented as our high priest all through the book of Hebrews, and presented as the fulfillment of the Old Testament priesthood. Now, in the Old Testament, the office and duties of the high priest, again, were a shadow. They were a type of the Christ which was to come. So they pointed to a coming Christ. We read in Hebrews 10, verse 1, for the law having a shadow of good things to come. So the entire priesthood of the Old Testament was a shadow of something better to come, that being Christ. An Old Testament priest basically was a go-between God and man, one who stood between God and man, who did something Godward in behalf of others, and one who ministered before God in behalf of others. So it was an office filled by those of the tribe of Levi. It was an office of consecration, that is, they had to be set apart from all other men. To be an Old Testament priest, of course, required a special degree of holiness, and the high priest was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, a type of the abode of God, a type of heaven, and then only, of course, on the Day of Atonement. So it was through the priest that God communed with man and communicated with God on behalf of man. He would hear the petitions of the troubled, the oppressed, the poor, the broken, who would come from the furthest ends of Israel with their burdens and their perplexities, and then he would present their burdens and their requests to the Lord. That was the office of the high priest, or the priest. The priest dealt with matters of sin, dealt with matters of judgment, for the people. He would hear confessions of sin. He would hear the pleadings for pardon, and then he would present such to God. So he was there to console the sorrowful. He was one to whom the sorrowful could tell their griefs, and then he would present that to God. So he would hear the desires of the people, and he would present such to the Lord. The priest would offer sacrifice for the people, and he would make intercession for the people, and then he would come forth to bless the people. Again, all of this was a shadow of things to come, of a greater priest. Now, again, all through Hebrews, Christ is declared to be this priest. In the book of Hebrews, the word priest occurs 26 times, all relating to either directly or indirectly to Christ. We read in Hebrews 4, verse 14, we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens. And then he tells us who this is. Jesus, the Son of God. That is, we have one who presents himself to God on our behalf, one who approaches and communicates with God for us, one who hears our confessions of sin, one who presents them to God, hears our petitions, presents those petitions to God on our behalf, and He's one who presents our burdens to God, one who makes intercession for us. And the one that does this is Jesus. Again, we have a great high priest that is passed. That is, through all the difficulties, through all the afflictions, through all the persecutions, through all the sufferings and the death and the grave, and he's passed into the heavens. So we have one right now who represents us before God. And again, he is Jesus. In Hebrews 9:24, we read, Christ is entered into heaven itself. We read in Hebrews 1:3, when he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. So he's in heaven. He sits at the right hand of God. In Hebrews 10, verse 12, but this man, Jesus, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins, forever sat down on the right hand of God. And there he sits. Jesus, the Son of God. He's at the right hand of God. That is a place of honor. He is at the right hand of God for us. So he is in this place of honor for us. He, at the right hand, he sits there as the accomplisher of his work. It's finished. And he sits there for us. He sits there as the conqueror of his foes. And he sits there for us, representing us. He sits there as the intercessor for us, as the channel of blessing. All blessings of God must come through Jesus Christ. He is the channel of those blessings. And there he sits as the Almighty One. He's also sitting there as the waiting one to receive us as his own. So again, in Hebrews 9:24, Christ is entered into heaven itself. But then notice, Hebrews 9:24, now, that is presently, to appear for us. So Christ right now, regardless of what our now consists of, it doesn't matter, appears for me before God. So it is Christ appearing in heaven for me right now. Hebrews 9:24. Christ has entered into heaven itself now. Then notice, to, stating the purpose, why he's in heaven, to appear in the presence of God, and this for us. So He is there to act for us in the presence of God. And this is now, right now. Regardless of circumstance, regardless of time, Christ, the Son of God, the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the Lord of Glory, the Prince of Life, the Alpha and the Omega, in the presence of God for us. He in whom the Father is well pleased, in the presence of God for us. He who is our righteousness has entered into heaven itself now to appear as our advocate in the presence of God for us. He who loves us as the Father loved Him is now in the presence of God for us. That is, right now, He is presenting Himself to God on our behalf. Right now, He communicates for us with God. He hears our confessions of sin. He presents them to God. In all of our confessions, they're all imperfect. They're all imperfect. But Christ presents them in His perfection, and they are accepted by God. He hears our petitions, and all of our petitions are imperfect. There's fault with every one of them, but He presents them to God in His perfection on our behalf. He hears our praises, and all of our praises are imperfect, and He presents them to God, and they are acceptable. As long as Christ presents them, they're acceptable to God. You and I can present nothing acceptable to God outside of Jesus Christ. So, Christ hath entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God before us. And then the assurance of this, Romans 8, verse 34, we read, Who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Everything is certain because of Christ sitting at the right hand of God. Now again, in our text, the writer is speaking of the superiority of Christ's priesthood to that of the Old Testament system. He states such in verse 23. He says, And they, that is the Old Testament priest, truly were many priests. There was one after another. Because the reason that this is so, they were not suffered or permitted to continue by reason of death. That is, they died, and someone would then replace them. But then we come to verse 24. But this man. But in contrast to the Old Testament priest who died, but this man. Who is this man? Well, it refers back to Jesus in verse 22, where He is called a surety. He is Jesus, He is a surety. But this man, a surety, one who agrees to undertake for another who is lacking in ability to discharge his own obligations. The surety is basically a sponsor for another. We have a sponsor that sits at the right hand of God for us. A surety is one who stands in the place of another. It is one who acts for another. And then notice the next phrase here in Hebrews 7. Verse 23, the surety, because They were not permitted to continue by reason of death. Because. But then notice, but this man, because. Okay, and then notice the next word. He. He's the reason. Because introduces the statement for the reason. Because He's the reason that Christ's priesthood is superior to the Old Testament priesthood. You could write lengthy paragraphs on why Christ's priesthood is superior to the Old Testament priesthood. But the writer of Hebrews breaks it down to one word. Because He. It's superior because this man. It's superior because of who He is. That's what makes it superior. And then notice what it says. Because He continueth ever. That is, He doesn't die like the Old Testament priesthood. So there's never a reason to have a replacement. There's never a reason to have another. The only reason they had a succession of priests in the Old Testament was because of death. But this man, because He continueth ever or forever. So again, it speaks of, it's in contrast to the Old Testament priests who were not permitted to continue by reason of death. So though our text speaks of the superiority of Christ's priesthood, there's no doubt as you read verses 22 through 28 that he is speaking of the superiority of Christ's priesthood to the Old Testament system. But that is really not the subject of the passage. The subject of the passage in reality is the person of Christ. The reason it's superior is because He. Because He. And then verse 25, wherefore? Stating a reason. Because, so we'll look back, because He is continuous, because He is immutable. Wherefore? In other words, there's never a single moment in which His priestly action, His watchful care of us, His loving sympathy, His working for us is not in full operation. For this reason, He is able. He is able. That speaks of His ability. Also, that is, in addition to His priestly functions, He is able also to save. The implication is some evil and danger to be delivered from. He is able to save them to the uttermost. That is, entirely and completely, that come unto God. In order to be saved, you have to come unto God. There's no salvation outside of coming to Him. But you can only come unto Him by one way. Come unto God by Him. By Him. It's the only way we can come. Seeing, that is, inasmuch as He ever liveth, unlike the Old Testament priest who died. 2, that is, indicative of a purpose, make, speaking of an action, intercession for them, the ones He came to save to the uttermost. So again, our text is speaking of the superiority of Christ's priesthood to that of the Old Testament system. But the main subject, the reason it is superior, is because of the superiority of the person of Jesus Christ. And there are several aspects of His person mentioned. In verse 24, He continueth ever. He's unchangeable. In verse 25, He ever liveth. In verse 26, He is holy. He is harmless. He is undefiled. He's separate from sinners. He's higher than the heavens. In verse 27, He needeth not, and He is sinless. And in verse 28, He's without infirmity. He's without any weakness. All the Old Testament priests had weaknesses. So again, though our text speaks of the superiority of Christ's priesthood to that of the Old Testament system, that's really not the subject of the passage. The subject of the passage is the person of Christ, the superiority of Christ, and that's why His priesthood is superior. In the book of Hebrews, He's presented as more than angels, more than Moses, more than Joshua, more than Aaron, more than Judaism, more than all the Old Testament types. He is the one who excels all. And that is really the subject. He excels all. Now again, concerning this, notice again verse 25. He, referring back to this man, and this man referring back to Jesus. So it could read, this man, Jesus, is our surety. Notice concerning this man, Jesus made a surety. He is. He is. He is able. He is able. Now skip a few words for the purpose of establishing the thought to the uttermost. He is able. He mentioned something very specific to save. But He is able to the uttermost. In the context of, He is our priest. He sits at the right hand of God for us. And the one who sits at the right hand of God for us is able to the uttermost. So again, those words need to be viewed in relation to Jesus undertaking for us. Jesus standing in our place, acting for us. And relative to such, He is able to the uttermost. Regardless of the situation, He is able to the uttermost. He is. He is everything He is. He's eternal. He's infinite. He's immutable. He's sovereign. He's almighty. He's all-knowing. He's a sustainer of all. He's all-sufficient. He's unequaled. He's incomparable. He's unrivaled. He's unsurpassed. He is the absolute authority. He is above all, over all, possesses absolute dominion over all. He rules. He's in control. He manages. He directs. He guides. He governs all things. And He sits at the right hand of God for us. And sitting there for us, He is able to the uttermost. He excels. He is more immense. He is superior to all. He's all-knowing. His knowledge is infinite. There's no end. His knowledge is perfect. His knowledge is perpetual. He is all-sufficient. He is all fullness. He is unfailing. He is inexhaustible. He is omnipresent. He sits at the right hand of God, but He's everywhere. He is Creator God. And being who He is, simply because of who He is able. Why is He able? Because of who He is. He is able. Jeremiah acknowledged such in Jeremiah 32, verse 17. He said, Lord God, behold, Thou hast made the heaven and the earth by Thy great power and stretched out arm. And then he went on to say, and there is nothing too hard for Thee. He is able. He is able to the uttermost. Jesus Christ created the universe out of nothing. And there is nothing too hard for Him. He is the one who placed the sun, the moon, the stars, the galaxies, and the planets in the sky, the one who created the mind-boggling distances of the stars, the one who created the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, created the thunder and the lightning, causes the grass to grow. He's the master of the wind, the rain, the snow, and the hail, and He's able. He is able to the uttermost. He is able. That speaks of His capability. Again, He is for us. He is our representative. He is our sponsor. It speaks of His competence. It speaks of His qualification. It speaks of His freedom to do whatever He pleases. He is able. But then notice, He is able to the uttermost. He is able to the uttermost. So think upon that word, uttermost. The word utter speaks of the utmost point or the highest degree. You could say He's utterly able. That is, He is able to the utmost point. He is able to the highest degree. But it's more than that. It says He is able to the uttermost. So you have the word utter, the utmost point, the highest degree. And then you add to that most. It means more than that. So it means to the greatest or highest degree. And beyond that, He is able. And that's why we read that we're unable to ask above what He is able. There in Ephesians 3 and verse 20, He is able to do. That is, He is able to work. He is able to carry it out. He's able to execute it. He's able to accomplish it. He's able to achieve it, bring it about exceedingly. That is, in a way that surpasses, exceeding abundantly. That is, you take abundantly and you exceed that. You go past that. It's the same as uttermost. In a way that is overflowing above all that we ask or think. All that we can ask, all that we can imagine. He is able to the uttermost. Now again, this is in the context of Him being our high priest. So it is in the context of what He is for us. He is able to the uttermost. So you take all of your needs, whatever they are. He is able to meet those needs to the highest point, to the highest degree. But you need to go further than that, to the uttermost. There are burdens which weigh people down, and there are trials, and there are difficulties that can appear to be unending. But He is able to the uttermost, to the highest degree and beyond. There are problems that are beyond the solution of man. Man does not have the solution. Man cannot implement the solution. But He is able to the uttermost, to the highest degree and beyond that. There are enemy fortifications which cannot be broken through by human strength, but He is able. There are wildernesses there appears to be no way out of. And since there's no way out of that wilderness, people just kind of settle in. But He is able to the highest degree and beyond that. There are valleys which appear endless. There are hurts, there are wounds, there are sorrows, there are heartaches. Sometimes it may appear there's no remedy. But He is able to the uttermost. There's that which is broken. Just look around society today. Everything's broken. It's all broken. It's all in ruins. But He's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. What's sadder than things being broken is when people try to convince you that it's not broken. It'll work fine. It's not broke. Well, it is broke. And again, everything in our society is broke. That's what happens when man sins and goes away from God. There's waste, there's ruin, no sign of restoration. But He is able to the uttermost. There are prisons with no release in sight, but He's able to the uttermost. So we need to embrace. We need to know it. We need to embrace it. He is able. But don't stop there. He is able to the uttermost. And He sits at the right hand of God for me. And He is able to the uttermost. And therefore I can say with Paul in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ, the one who is able to the uttermost. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. So that's where we need to place our confidence. He is able to the uttermost. That's one you can depend on. You can depend upon Him. That's one in whom you ought to be firmly persuaded. It's one that you can fully trust in. One that you can lean upon. One that you can look to for all things. One for whom you can come to and plead with. He is able to the uttermost. And oh, what a blessed life to walk with Him who is able to the uttermost. What a blessed life to go with Him who is able to the uttermost. This world is filled with things that we do not like. This world again is filled with ruins. But we don't go by ourselves. We go with Him who is able to the uttermost. We can talk with Him. We can cast all upon Him. And we ought to live our lives knowing He is able. He is able to the uttermost. That is, God can to the highest degree, and beyond that, God can. So just give it all to Him. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song.